Time Travel in the Sandman versus Demon Slayer as Adaptations by Elfie Pike. That's me. So, how do adaptations handle visual versus narrative changes? I don't fully explore this. This is a very short thing. This is just my ramblings video on this because I didn't want to work. So, that's what you're getting, some ramblings. No ideas fully explored. I'm very interested in other people's thoughts on this as well, especially if you are my friend. In this case, I don't mean time travel as a trope or narrative function, but the experience as an audience engaging with the work, like how, oh, we're always traveling through time, blah, blah, blah. But specifically, what does it feel like to go through the flow of a story, right? How does a work help you travel through time? How does a work impede your engagement in a story due to time travel issues like pacing or confusion? How much does visual aesthetic affect the experience of time travel? And again, I'm not like getting into this because I wrote this in like an hour while I should have been checking my emails. But that's what you're getting. This is sort of these are things that I think about quite frequently, especially since pacing issues are often the number one thing that I struggle with in terms of picking up new comics or watching a new TV show or whatever. That's my number one complaint for sure. The basics of time travel in a comic versus TV show, like they both have the same large structure stuff, but they do specific things differently, right? So, like in a comic, time travel is achieved by visual pacing primarily because it's a visual medium. That's what you got, right? You've got page layouts, you've got negative and positive space, you've got a sense of action and flow in the page that leads the reader through the story. And for some works or for some pages of some works, this will be very fast. For others, this is much slower. It's common for me personally to put down a comic if I feel like its layout flow is stagnant or choppy without purpose. You can be choppy with purpose, that's fine. But sometimes you pick up a page and you're like, there's no sense of where this is going. And other times you pick up a page, like a comic, and you flip to a page and you're like, wow, immediately my eye is drawn to this. I look around this and I want to see what's happening and I want to look at it. And sometimes I've seen people comment that they don't know how to read a comic because how do you know when you're done looking at a picture? And the idea for me, now I can't really speak to that because I've been reading comics for so long that I can't like give advice on that. But I would say that there's a feeling of a good comic will let you know when it's time to stop because you feel like you want to keep going, right? On a TV show, however, more so than just the literal passage of time while you watch, we're talking about editing, cinematography, dialogue, working together to make the literal passage of time feel like the appropriate amount of time. Soundtrack also affects this as well. And these can use some of the same tools as comics, but are confined to, first of all, TV aspect ratios, or visibly work to change those in ways that are different from comics paneling. Like, does it switch from widescreen to full screen format, for example, which can always be really interesting. Another element of this is also that I don't think I put this in a note, but the difference between having in a comic two panels that are next to each other versus having a TV show recreate those panels, but as events, one right after the other. Um, that's an interesting element of time travel in the sense that sometimes it really doesn't work from one area to the other, either from a TV show becoming a comic or from a comic becoming a TV show. And sometimes it works really well because the intent behind both is the same and they were used in similar fashions. And that's really interesting to me. Also in a TV show, just like in a comic, really, but the story beats and visuals set up flow and tensions, which affect the sense of the passage of time. And it happens in a more interestingly chronological way because, again, in a comic, you can they're designed to be read in specific orders, but you also can look at them in any order you want. And I sometimes find that that's really an interesting part of reading comics too, is that you can go back and forth in a different way than you can in a TV show, or at least it's easier to do in a comic because of especially if you're talking about physical volumes, right? Okay, so for me, time travel works when you feel engaged with the work and enjoy how it is progressing. And I put enjoy in quotes there because, typically enjoyment is thought of as being like, a generally positive thing. However, I would say for the purposes of media, enjoy doesn't mean feels good necessarily. Like it does mean feels good in the literal sense that maybe your reactions to it are interesting and compelling to you, but I wouldn't say feels good and it like makes you happy or whatever. I mean this in a highly personal, what makes you feel like a narrative is working way. If it works for you, then for the purposes of this work, you enjoy it, right? Like, and I enjoy both Demon Slayer and Sandman, both the comics and the TV shows, although in different ways. Um, the way in which time travel functions for the work via editing, layout, etc., is also relevant. So a story that is slow doesn't necessarily mean boring if the time travel is effective, right? Um, Time travel does not work when there's a mismatch between the flow of the story and the feel of it. So a story that is too fast may not give you time to enjoy the progression of elements or theme or character. And in a comic, too fast might mean that the page layouts are cluttered, although that might feel slow, I guess. But a cluttered page layout might impede your feeling of the story going, or a paneling that doesn't allow you to like get to know the characters because it's concerned with other things. But like a TV show, definitely the pacing is more easily. I think it's more easy to intuitively understand what I mean because again, you're sitting there being having the passage of time forced upon you. Yes, many of our programs let us do things like play at a higher speed or a slower speed or whatever. But still, um, a story that's too slow may be boring to engage with. And again, this is going to be different depending on the medium. So, like I said before, for me, paneling that feels choppy will impede the sense of a story flow for me in a comic. Whereas a TV show that spends too long on its frames or too long on certain scenes will eventually feel like it's bogged down by the weight of like not knowing what to do or when to cut. Or the time travel actively impedes the flow. So, you know, sometimes the narrative is just badly done. They don't know what they should be doing. I would like to say this, The Sandman is a comic, obviously. So it was designed first and foremost to be a comic book. It came out at a time when there were comic adaptations into movies and TV shows, but that was not exactly the purpose of it. The DC Vertigo print was very intentionally sort of, I'm going to say, edgelord. And I mean that in, you know, I was the target audience, even though I definitely wasn't the target audience because I was like, a child when it first started coming out. But I was still like the target audience by the time I found it. And I think the people for whom the Sandman resonates with are the target audience of that style of comic. And also, its page layouts frequently explicitly work because they are a page. All good comics do this. All good comics do a thing where uh, they have to be comics because that's how they look. And I would say that's true of most narratives that are very good work the way they do in the medium that they're in because they are explicitly doing things that that medium does well. Um, there's plenty of stories that can be told differently in different mediums, but certainly The Sandman as a comic is very specifically a comic. I know they've also adapted it at this point into an audio drama. I haven't listened to that, so I have no thoughts on that at this point. As a TV show adaptation, I think it does some very smart things. The comic flows very much as here's a series of stories, and the connection is that there is our guy Morpheus. Maybe the story is about Morpheus. Maybe the story is about somebody who knows Morpheus. Or maybe Dream just appears to great effect at some point. And it flows in an American comics way, deliberate, more panels per page than manga typically, and frequently uses atypical layouts to convey dreams. But a TV show, especially one released for binging, works better with a different sense of time travel, in my opinion. I think the biggest changes with regarding to time travel um, from the comic to the TV show, and the things that worked really well are that everything is connected internally to the show itself versus to other DC Comics universe stuff. Like the comic, I've been rereading it, and the comic is very much a DC universe comic. Like it is obviously a different kind of story than what the mainstream DC titles probably were doing at the time. But it has characters who are explicitly who are explicitly like other pre-existing characters, which is probably part of the reason why they weren't brought over the same way, because of rights reasons. But also you have stuff like, oh, John Dee was in Arkham, things like that. So there's stuff that they had to change both for rights reasons, but also that don't make sense if you're not already a fan, so having them not wouldn't necessarily have been a benefit to the show. Um, and then this connection that the internal connections that they create are planted early and pay off throughout the series. That's something that I personally really like. I really like when a narrative like sets up a question and then answers it, and they set up an idea and then they show you how it plays out. That's what I find really satisfying, and I don't find it to be problematic to have it like like foreshadowing. I think foreshadowing is good. I think it can be boring, but I don't think it's boring the way they did it in this. And I think that, jump scaring the audience with unexpected ideas is typically bad, actually. They also use the opportunity of the show to reconfigure characters for thematic purposes. Dream is now represented by a human person. So the story is about understanding human people rather than engaging with the endless concept of dreams as much anyway. Whereas I would say the book is the comic is continually asking, what does it mean to dream? What does it mean to engage with dreams? And it's less the character development regarding Morpheus is still there, but it's not the point necessarily. And I really like the stories that are about people, characters learning to forge connections with others and to regard those connections as important and vital. So that kind of narrative change really works for me personally. I also personally feel like this change especially benefits a lot of the female characters who either barely appear in the comics or are barely characterized there. I also think it gave up on certain elements, either for budget or whatever reason. So, like the visual style of the Sandman comics would not be impossible to replicate for television. I personally think a rotoscoped mixed media thing like Bakshi's Lord of the Rings would be an interesting way of handling it. But would that be the most effective way of telling their story within the budget? That's a question. I clearly forgot to do my animations for this page as well. And since the last time I read the comics before watching the show was like 20 years ago, I think I was the right audience as of a Sandman fan for this. But I can't really be mad at someone who's unhappy that Dream didn't get like his flame robe. Like rereading the comics means that all I want is for Dream to have his cool flame robes. And I feel like some of the visual elements should have been possible to do even within the context of a more human Dream, although they could have made him a monster boy. In other words, I think the Sandman adaptation is very good. And I've had the soundtrack stuck in my head for days, and I probably will continue to do so. And like, again, I'm super not mad in my heart if you feel like it has lost something by being a larger narrative rather than a series of stories, or by moving to a medium more visually restrictive. Like I didn't use any examples in this of the actual art, but his portrayal in the comics is very monstrous. In not so much to be a nightmare, but very much like this is not a human person you're looking at. Whereas because the series is about this person who looks like a person becoming more connected to other people who may or may not be humans, um, they're going for a different vibe. They go for the let's have a human face and let's have that human face be pretty. Um, but yeah, not mad at people who wanted more, and yeah, they should give him more clothes that are fancier. That's my thought. Demon Slayer is a Shonen Jump manga. And while no manga can be made intentionally for anime, because that would be kind of jumping the gun, Shonen Jump properties are frequently anime. And I think the editors think about that kind of thing a lot. And also, Shonen Jump, the pacing or whatever, like DC Vertigo, what it was doing was different, So, Demon Slayer came out weekly for its entire run. It's a battle series about trauma and working together to defeat impossible foes, which is also solid TV stuff. Like its narrative is very much something that you could easily see on a TV show. And there are still elements of the storytelling that primarily work better as a comic for me personally. The Demon Slayer TV adaptation is extremely faithful in terms of like dialogue used and stuff. And is that a good thing regarding time travel? So this is where we get into my like negative person Demon Slayer opinions. To be clear, again, I like the series a lot. I really enjoy the show. I haven't caught up on the second season, although I did see the movie. But for example, one of the things that really struck me, I read the series after watching the first season. And there's a point when Best Boy Tanjiro meets the pillars, right? And in the show, I remember thinking, God, this takes so long. But in the manga, it's a single page. You see all of the pillars' thoughts as they encounter Tanjiro. And so, because of how time travel works in comics, the feel of that is really different than how it works in the TV show. Where in the anime, it's turned into this extended moment where we must go through each character in turn and learn their thoughts. And I would say personally that that's a flaw because that felt like it just dragged and dragged. And I don't know the quote unquote best way to to have changed that. Personally, I probably would have done something where you get more individual cutaway moments and you don't try to be as exactly faithful to exactly the order in which things happened in the manga and turning that to exactly the order in which they happen on the screen. And I'll be real, I haven't compared them. Maybe they are already slightly different, but I just remember when I read the comic, I was like, oh, it's one panel. So it's all supposed to be happening at the same time because that's how comics work. You can have things that are happening at the same moment, but be understood by us on individual levels because that's how we read things. Whereas in a TV show, you can't really do that because you get what an overlap of dialogue that wouldn't make any sense. Or you get what they did, where you get this extended scene and you get these individual moments that are just kind of all in a row. um, and yeah, no, it did not work for me, and I found it poorly handled, especially since you're talking about a time where Tanjiro's like tied up. What's going to happen to him? There's other moments that feel more emphatically important about this scene that I thought dragged. However, there are times where they weren't faithful to the timing of the comics, and I thought it was that these were powerful adaptation moments. And specifically, I think the anime excels with the fight animations and in general the look and feel of the world. It is so clearly based on the manga, but it is also the kind of thing, especially with the fight scenes, that could only be done on a film or TV show. Like, the manga has the fight scenes. The fight scenes are integral to the manga. They are emphatic and important in the manga. But the ways in which the manga fight scenes feel is so different to me to how the anime fight scenes feel. And this is not necessarily saying that the manga fight scenes are bad. Again, I like the manga a lot. I actually like the manga more than the anime, but the anime fight scenes frankly make the whole thing worth it. Like like they did such a good job of imagining what these techniques would actually look like and transforming that into something that you the viewer could engage with in such a cool visceral way. They make them feel like they have effort and importance. I don't know. I think there are ways that could it's yeah, it clearly draws from the source, but it makes it a thing that in the medium makes sense. And finally, I don't really have a conclusion. Like I said at the beginning, these are just thoughts that I have. I'm interested in other people's thoughts as well. Obviously, this is a topic that I'm sure other people have gotten into. There are probably academic papers about this kind of thing already. Scott McCloud also famously has that. Is it McCloud? The Understanding Comics, which goes really in depth into how and why comics paneling works. Why do comics work? Why does the representation of people work in comics, in sequential art? I also remember I followed somebody who did a lot of stuff about what made a manga accessible. I think it was Telophase on LiveJournal years ago. Um, did a whole series of things about like what made manga paneling accessible and compared it like Fruits Basket, which had like was one of the most popular manga at the time. And I mean, still probably. And the way its page layouts like flowed really well versus something like Sayuki, which has such a different sense of paneling, but also really works well, and in part because of how it uses gutters and things like that. Um, and I think it's really interesting to think how to look at how adaptations handle things. I think it's really interesting to sort of see what they took away or what they made different. And actually, one of the things that I found really fascinating about the Sandman adaptation was, um, like, yeah, they changed the race of a bunch of the characters and some of the gender of them. But like, those weren't the character changes that I thought were uh, at all ones that I would question. Like, all of those character changes, like obviously you're gonna cast I think it's Kirby Baptiste. I don't remember her name, but obviously the death they cast is like perfect. You know what I mean? I feel like the casting was outrageously good in the Sandman. And it was just really funny to me to be rereading the series and be like, oh, that's interesting. While I reread the comics and see the ways in which the stories are the same, but also are different. And personally, I do think that the Sandman adaptation works better for me as a show than the Demon Slayer one does. And some of the comics haven't aged well. That's sometimes a little bit of part of it. Um, I do wonder what it would have been like with a more monstrous Morpheus. And that's like partially because that's something my one of my roommates is really into is the fact that he doesn't dream in the comics doesn't feel like a human being because he's not a human being. But part of that is also like I it's just one of those curiosities. What would they have done? I think that if you wanted a more visually accurate, quote unquote, to the comics feeling, I personally would have gone with animation. Like I said, I think rotoscoped animation would have been really interesting, or it could have done something where it mixed up the dream versus reality. I always think rotoscoping looks so interesting in the classic like painting over, not just in the sense that's used in CGI now. Um, I always think that feel is really interesting and cool. And, frankly, a lot of the stuff that doesn't work for me, and one of the reasons why I thought about these two things together, a lot of the stuff that doesn't work for me in the Demon Slayer show is stuff that is only really apparent because it's a TV show and now you have to actually experience time in the way that it has you experience time. Like, there are characters in the show. Look, I love everybody I support you all in your faves, but there are some characters that do not work for me in the show because now I have to hear them talking to me. And I'm like, this is too much. Stop. Stop talking at me. Whereas in the comic, it's not going to be that experience because they don't have a voice that I have to listen to. My experience of them is visual. My experience of them is controlled based on my own experience of time. And I thought that that was a really interesting vibe. Because again, I would actually, recommend both of these things. Anyway, I think I'm coming up to the free recording cutoff. So I'm going to stop there. Let me know your thoughts if you have any. Um, do you like either of these adaptations? Do you not like any of either of them? Do you prefer the comics to the TV show in either one of them? Yeah. Do you think being Western versus being DC Comics versus Shonen Jump has a big difference in terms of how the adaptations went as well? Anyway, they're both very popular, so probably have some thoughts on it. Bye.